My question is, why not to try to combine idea of producing brain and filtering brain? For example, if you develop something like Ouroboros recurrence structure, it could be mind producing by filtering and then repeating the same cycle again and again.
Well, yes. I mean, actually, it seems to me it's remarkably difficult to try and experimentally distinguish between a filter theory and a production theory, because I mean, no one denies that so long as your consciousness is linked to the brain, clearly anything you experience is going to have some manifestation in the brain. I mean, so it's very, very hard to think of an experimental test. I mean, there are some, for example, if you have a near-death experience, and in the near-death experience, when your brain is dead, you seem to be reliving your life and having all sorts of going through the light and meeting whatever you're doing. I mean, clearly that might be regarded as evidence that the consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but the trouble is that most people are rather skeptical about that. I mean, they're maybe more interestingly, people take psychedelics and they find that they have expanded sense of awareness under psychedelics, but the part of the brain you might think was going to be activated becomes depressed, you know, so there's very little. So I think there are possible ways of distinguishing between these. But you're sort of asking in terms of the Ouroboros whether there's some way. I mean, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, because, but I think that it does ultimately make a difference. I mean, the question is, from the materialist perspective, is that all that exists is matter, the brain is matter, and consciousness arises as an emergent phenomena. And so that is a very different perspective from the one which says that the consciousness is there and merely will manifest through any system, any part of the universe which is sufficiently sophisticated to have a memory and some, you know, the view of the filter theorists would be consciousness pre-exists, but wherever you have a system in the universe which is sufficiently complex to have a model of the world, consciousness will arise. So this is rather like the Tononi view, that sufficient complexity will give rise to consciousness. But ultimately, those do seem to me to be two very different views. Either there is consciousness with a big C, or there isn't. I'm not quite sure how one can argue that both views are compatible with the Ouroboros. But I may be wrong. I may be wrong, but I find it hard to see how they can be different perspectives. Both can be true. It seems to me either there is consciousness with a big C, or there isn't. It seems to me. I'm not quite sure how they can be a middle ground there. I'll be interested in anybody's views on that.
Any more questions, comments? Jan?
Yeah, I'm still consuming so much interesting information that it will take a couple of days to recover.
I'm sorry about that, yes.
No, thank you so much. I have a question with respect to what you mentioned about that sometimes you can have the perception that time is slowing down. I know from people having car accidents, I know it from my own experience. When I do the photography of very fast or very unpredictable animals like butterflies, there is a moment when I'm so focused, then suddenly they go slower, or I can follow things which normally I can't follow. It happens at the sort of moment when I focus so much that I sort of stop thinking, if I sort of try to explain it. Do you have a feeling about what happens exactly at that moment, or what could trigger that suddenly this change in the perception of time takes place?
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist, and of course, people have studied the experience of time and the change of the species present, if you like. I mean, I don't think they normally use that term, and I think there is some understanding in terms of, clearly the brain does have its own internal clock. And clearly, you know, the rate at which time flows depends upon psychological factors like how hard you're concentrating. You know, time flows when you're having a good time, and it goes slowly when you're just sitting at home doing nothing. And so it's clear that, and then some people train themselves, you know, to change the specious present. And I think there's even evidence that people athletes, for example, who have to have enormously fast reaction times. You know, you're playing tennis and you're shooting the tennis ball at 150 miles an hour. It's amazing the brain can react fast enough. And it seems that at some level, the specious present can be changed, either consciously or unconsciously. And indeed, if people meditate, it's clear that the specious present can change. But the question is, you know, a reductionist, a normal neuroscientist would doubtless just say, that's because you're doing something to the brain. You know, a chemical effect. You can take a drug. Certain drugs will speed up or slow down increase or decrease your specious present. And presumably that's a chemical effect on the brain. So I'm not denying the effect of the brain there. But what I was particularly interested in was situations which are more extreme, where your specious present changes more dramatically, because, you know, people will have a mystical experience where, in some sense, the specious present might expand to include their whole life, so they see the whole existence at a moment, or even the whole history of the cosmos, you know. So people will claim that they can see in this sort of cosmic consciousness, that they see the whole history of the universe at one moment. Or even shrink the specious present so that you only exist, you know, right now at a very, very small instant. So the specious present goes to almost infinity and almost to zero. And so the question is, can something like that be described by brain function? And that's what I find rather difficult, because you probably gathered from my talk that I take the view that consciousness can in some sense exist separated from the body. And the idea is that when the consciousness is separated from the body, the brain is no longer acting as a filter, so that you're opened up to different experiences of time. And so that's why I was raising the concept that there might be different levels of consciousness in the universe, even on a physical level, you know, where the specious present is very different. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but it's a very interesting question.
To some extent, it induced a lot of thinking, I think, for
thank you.
Next day. Yeah, thank you so much for your sharing your ideas. Yeah.
Sarah.
That was fascinating. Thank you. So just a follow-up question to the one Jan just asked. So it sounds a little bit like you're suggesting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that, you know, if you can stretch your specious present to infinity, that gives you universal consciousness, as if those are on a par. Universal consciousness comes with having. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I shouldn't have said infinity. I don't like infinity. But I mean, the point I should stress is that in the approach I'm making is that it's not just that there's human consciousness and cosmic consciousness. I take the view that there's a sort of hierarchy of consciousnesses which operate on a hierarchy of different species, increasing specious presence. And so the idea would be that there might even, I mean, talk in rather sort of New Age terms, you've got individual consciousness. You might think there was a sort of planetary level of consciousness, which might have a specious presence of a day or something like that, in which we're all part. There might be a sort of galactic level of consciousness, you know, which incorporates all the civilizations, if you believe they exist in the galaxy, which might have an even longer time scale, 1 million years or something. And then there might be a cosmic level of consciousness, which might be, you know, tens of billions of years or something like that. But of course, I'm just talking. There's no evidence for any of this. I'm just speculating, because the main point I'm making is I don't see why there should only be consciousness on the level of the specious presence of 1 second. In other words, it's just as we know, observing the universe through electromagnetic radiation, we know we only see it through a very narrow range of wavelengths, and we know it can be observed with other instruments and a much broader range of wavelengths. The same with consciousness. Maybe there's a consciousness operating in the universe which is on at times with a species present very little, very different from a second. And I can't prove that because one of the frustrations is that these different levels of consciousness, they can't interact. You know, I can't interact with someone whose species present is only a nanosecond because he ceases to exist by the time I get to the end of my species present. And I can't interact with someone whose species present is a million years because I'm dead by the time he's had time to think, have a thought. So, I mean, it's rather frustrating. This might be rather hard to prove, but I would say if there's any element of support, it comes through, I suppose, mystical experience. And those sorts of experiences which most scientists don't, attach much credence to. But thank you for that question.
Would it be fair to say, Bernard, that your starting point is that physics is a science of perceptions? I mean, Marcus has made a compelling case for that today, that physics basically models and predicts what we are going to perceive next. And what you are doing extra is that you are taking other modes of perception, if you will, seriously. You are saying, when I'm dreaming, that's a form of perception as well, a perception in dream space, which should also be amenable to physical modeling, just like regular perception is. And if that is so why can't you model that with physics? Isn't that what you're trying to do?
Exactly, you put it very well indeed, and that's why I was very interested in Marcus's presentation, because I mean it is putting the emphasis on what you can see, on perception. To me, I see physics as giving you a model of perception and reconciling our different perceptions of the world. But of course, in that description, indeed the whole cosmic Ouroboros, one's only talking about the physical world. I mean, even when Marcus was talking about Boltzmann brains, he was talking about physical material systems. What I'm trying to say is I want to extend the discussion beyond normal material objects, because I want to talk about things like my memories and my visualizations and my out-of-body experiences and my mystical experiences. So I'm going beyond what Marcus was saying, but obviously I'm only doing that by taking seriously phenomena which most of my fellow scientists, don't take seriously. But obviously, I think to a large extent that's simply because most physicists, most people don't have these experiences. And I think if you have experiences, you're more likely to take them seriously. But I must stress, I continuously stress that the view I presented is not standard physics. And whether this expanded physics is ever even going to be called physics, I don't know. You might want to call it hyperphysics, because most physicists will not be at all happy at expanding physics to accommodate these sorts of phenomena. So it's just my own particular view. And nor am I saying it's correct, I mean, I've spent, 50 years or whatever thinking about these ideas, but sometimes I think it's all crazy because as somebody said in one of the questions before we started, is there any evidence for these higher dimensions, even in physics? And the fact of the matter is that actually there isn't yet any evidence for these higher dimensions. We haven't yet experimentally discovered them at CERN or anything like that. It doesn't mean they don't exist, because they might just be, it's all dependent on the scale of the extra dimensions, whether you can determine it. But it is true that we don't have any experimental evidence for these extra dimensions, even in straightforward physics. And we don't have any experimental evidence that M theory is correct. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that respectable physicists, some of the biggest brains on the planet, think about these things. And so I think they could be evidence eventually for higher dimensions. And then, of course, the question is the idea that those higher dimensions have got something to do with mental space, is that viable? And that's an even more speculative idea. And on the face of it, it's crazy, because if they discovered extra dimensions at CERN, is that really saying something about mental space? I mean, on the face of it, that's a bizarre idea. And so sometimes I think this whole idea is crazy, but other times I think, no, this is whatever idea we're going to have, whatever paradigm we're going to need to reconcile matter and mind, it is going to be crazy.
At least with our prejudices. Yeah.
Yes.
Bernard, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.